So, there's been a theory going around in the Zelda community for a little while now regarding Tears of the Kingdom's past and its timeline placement. Now, specifically, this theory is placing Tears of the Kingdom's past somewhere before Skyward Sword, and at the very least, in between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time. Now, a lot of people, for whatever reason, are claiming that there's no contradictory evidence for this theory, and so that's why it's valid. But there are some inherent issues with this theory that are actually quite obvious if you're familiar with The Legend of Zelda's lore. But before we get into that, why is it that some people might believe or come up with such a theory in the first place? Well, one, there is a statement from Rauru in Tears of the Kingdom's cutscenes where he claims that he is the first king of Hyrule, a kingdom that they just founded. And the other might be the fact that everything has this sort of air of ancient or old history to it throughout the game as you're looking at those past events. Now, our first issue with this theory is regarding the races that we see present in Tears of the Kingdom's past cutscenes. Now, if you're familiar with Hyrule's history and lore, then you will also probably recognize a problem with this as we are pointing it out. Now, what we mean by this is, during the cutscenes involving the sages, we see a number of individuals who belong to species or races of people that would not have existed yet until much later than Skyward Sword. This is most obvious with the Rito, who did not exist until much, much later than Skyward Sword and many of the earlier Zelda games, but it's also prevalent with the Zora, who did not exist yet until closer to Ocarina of Time. We see what might be their ancestors in Skyward Sword, but other than that, there's no sign of them. Now, aside from these, probably the most compelling argument can be made for the Gerudo, whom we know branched off from the Hylians and were likely descended from Roos, this guy we see right here. In fact, this leads us to our next problem with this theory. And that is the existence of Ganondorf that we see in Tears of the Kingdom's past. Now, this poses a number of problems, seeing as one, he's a Gerudo, and two, Demise hasn't made his curse yet, which is what makes Ganondorf evil in the first place. Now, if Demise couldn't have made his curse, and the Gerudo couldn't have been born, then Ganondorf poses an obvious problem. Now, another problem with this theory is regarding the landscape of Hyrule. Now, what we mean by this is that the landscape that we see in Skyward Sword is significantly different than that which we see in Tears of the Kingdom's past. And if they were so close to each other historically, then the landscape would likely be much more similar. But that is simply not the case. In fact, the landscape that we see in Tears of the Kingdom's past is almost identical to the landscape that we see in Breath of the Wild and in Tears of the Kingdom's present, which honestly suggests that they are a lot closer to each other in the timeline than we probably realize. And on that note, let's talk about Hyrule Castle for a minute. Another problem is that according to the theory, Ganondorf and Rauru would be trapped beneath Hyrule Castle from the beginning of their conflict before Skyward Sword, all the way up until the time that they're discovered in Tears of the Kingdom's present. Now, the idea that they're just sitting there for thousands and thousands of years beneath everyone's noses without being discovered is kind of hard to believe, and the fact that Hyrule Castle has been destroyed and rebuilt multiple times, and also moved throughout the series, makes this quite unlikely. One prime example being in Ocarina of Time, where the castle is literally completely gone and there's just a gaping hole full of lava where it used to be. Whether that was ripped out of the ground or it was completely obliterated would make it difficult to remain hidden. Now, at this point, it's quite obvious that placing Tears of the Kingdom's past before Skyward Sword wouldn't really make sense, but some people might still try to make the argument that you can squeeze it in between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, but there are some issues with this as well. Even if you disregard events that took place between Skyward Sword and Ocarina of Time, this would be difficult considering that Rauru and everyone else in Hyrule has no idea or recollection of the Master Sword, Link, the Triforce, and many other things that would be recent history at that point if it took place during this period. In fact, the only person who seems to recognize any of those things is Ganondorf, of all people, which even further weakens this theory. But if this theory doesn't work, then where does Tears of the Kingdom's past fit in the Zelda timeline? Well, where it obviously belongs, probably somewhere between the Era of Myth and Breath of the Wild. According to Fujibayashi, one of the directors of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, it could be a different Hyrule that Rauru is talking about when he refers to himself being the first king of Hyrule. This notion comes from the statement made in the Notorious No DLC interview with Famitsu shortly after the game's release, where when asked if Tears of the Kingdom's past is the story of Hyrule's founding, he mentions that if it does tell a story of Hyrule's founding, it was probably destroyed at least once before that. This implies that it could be a refounding of the kingdom rather than the original. What exactly does he mean by this? Well, the fact that we've seen other Hyrules be founded throughout the series, and the kingdom has fallen and risen multiple times through civil wars, conflicts, and other calamities, it could very well be a new Hyrule, or a different Hyrule. And to Rauru's knowledge, maybe even the only Hyrule. Now, this actually makes a lot of sense. But what do you guys think? Do you agree with this theory, or should it be banished to the gap between dimensions? Either way, feel free to let us know in the comments down below. We look forward to making future content, so if you liked our video and you'd like to stick around to see what else we do, then feel free to like and subscribe. We hope you enjoyed our video, and we hope to see you all in the next one. Thank you for watching. Peace.